Good morning, and thank you for having us. Imagine the South African commercial property market like a grand chessboard, where every move matters in creating a more sustainable environment. Currently, the net zero target for new build is 2030, and for existing build is 2050. Going back to that chess analogy, imagine this: drivers on the one side, barriers on the other, both eager to make their mark on net zero implementation. As we carry on this strategic journey today, I want you to be mindful of this chess analogy. I am Sindiswe Kalumba, and joining me for a game of chess, my research partner, Volker. Our topic is an examination of the uptake of net zero buildings in the South African commercial property market. You might hear us refer to the term NZBs. These are net zero buildings. Net zero buildings can be divided into 4 categories, each with its own definition from the GBCSA. They can either be in carbon, water, waste, or ecology. Our examination looked at all 4 buildings. However, there was a focus on net carbon buildings because this is where most of the data lied. Our agenda is as follows. Firstly, we'll discuss our key literature findings and how that led to our problem statement. Then, we'll state our research aim and research question. Finally, we'll uncover our fascinating research findings in looking at the 5 emerging themes, then our empirical model, where the chess analogy will come back again.
This will answer the question, what does all of this mean? So in our examination, we performed a thorough literature review as well as a multiple case study analysis with 4 different commercial property organizations where we conducted semi-structured interviews with each case. So when we looked at the literature more thoroughly, there were notable arguments to be considered. So firstly, there was no consensus on the definition of a net zero building. So we reviewed literature across multiple countries where it seemed that each country seemed to have a variation of the definition of net zero buildings. This obviously originates from the concept of net zero, referring to zero carbon emissions, while a net zero building focuses more on overall resource efficiency. Secondly, design strategies are still being established. This means that innovation is required from design teams who are looking to take on net zero buildings. On top of that, different climate regions have different design requirements, meaning designs can't simply be copied from country to country, they do need to be adapted. Thirdly, we noticed that there was very little existing literature on net zero ecology buildings. This obviously limited the extent to which we could analyze this type of building. And in all of this, we noticed that there was a heavy focus on barriers. So this implies that the literature isn't portraying the benefits or the drivers of a net zero building, not necessarily encouraging commercial organizations to take on this journey. This led us to our problem statement. Net zero building implementation presents a unique set of drivers and barriers to the South African commercial property market. Our research question was, what are the drivers and barriers to net zero building implementation in the South African commercial property market? So today we'll be identifying these drivers and barriers for you. In our literature review, we attempted to unpack the concept of net zero. And when doing so, we noticed that net zero buildings, green buildings, energy efficient buildings, and smart buildings all overlap, and they cannot be isolated when attempting to examine each of these topics separately.
When it came to our research findings, we were able to collect our data from semi-structured interviews with 4 property organizations. Each of these property organizations, we assigned a case study. These are the emerging themes from our thematic analysis. Firstly, net zero building types and their features. Across all the case studies, there was a discussion on the rising energy usage and cost, therefore making it an organizational priority to reduce this. This meant that the most common net zero building that was discussed was the net zero carbon building. Secondly, the cost of net zero building. Cost was seen as the most common barrier. However, in case study 4, it was mentioned that a net zero building by nature is a high performance building and should not necessarily cost more than another high performance building if net zero is seen as an initial goal and not done for points only. Thirdly, the emergence of net zero buildings. Net zero buildings are in their infancy in South Africa. Therefore, they have an opportunity to see advanced countries such as the UK and adopt and adapt that to fit in the South African context. Fourthly, drivers. On a positive note, all case studies saw benefits in net zero buildings. This included operational cost savings, attracting corporate tenants, mostly international, and the environmental benefits. With the quote, "If it's good for the environment, it's good for the business," being quoted by case study 1 and case study 2. Finally, barriers. All cases acknowledged challenges in supply chains. This is because NZBs are in their infancy, so it was mentioned that technology and materials will need to be imported. However, in case study 4, it was mentioned that with the right team composition, these will no longer be barriers.
So here's the empirical model that Sindiswe and I developed from our analysis of the 4 case studies. As you can see, it's far more complex than just drivers and barriers. When we drew up this model, we realized that the colors of the barriers, the amber zone, and the drivers represented that of a traffic light. So we'll be unpacking each of these sections of the empirical model to follow. But before we do that, Sindiswe, I challenge you to a game of chess. I'll represent the barriers and you can do the drivers.
I accept. I'll start with the economic drivers that were seen as a pro in net zero building implementation. This included the opportunity for operational cost savings. And when we look at the rising energy cost, this can be mitigated through the energy efficient design and renewable resources, making property investments more future-proofed, both in the operational sense and the business sense.
Well, I'll match your move because just like there are economic drivers, there are also economic barriers or side effects. So this, of course, includes your green premium, the uncertainty of payback period savings, and of course, each commercial organization will have its own budget constraints.
My next move is the technical drivers. NZBs are designed for the future in mind, meaning that they have a longer lifespan than a conventional building. There are some South African innovative solutions that can be used in NZB design.
Technical. Okay, well, South Africa also possesses a limited skill set, limited materials, and limited knowledge on the topic of net zero, not to forget, of course, the technical challenges that arise when attempting to retrofit an existing building as opposed to developing one from scratch.
When it comes to the social benefits, NZBs are designed to enhance the social benefits of its occupants. There is a tenant demand for buildings such as these, so having an NZB in your company's portfolio can increase its public perception.
Okay, I can't match you on social, but let's talk about technology. So there's a great need for technological advancement in the country at the moment, implying that there's also limited availability of the required materials for net zero building implementation.
I understand your perspective, but when it comes to the environmental benefits, there's no way the barriers can outweigh the drivers. NZBs are crucial in pollution mitigation, conserving of water, climate change mitigation, and enhancing the natural beauty of the environment. Therefore, it's a checkmate in favor of the drivers.
So we presented you with multiple examples of both drivers and barriers. But what we realized in this is that net zero building implementation isn't just black and white like a game of chess. So I'll be unpacking the traffic light areas now. So firstly, we have the red, the barriers. So we identified 3 categories of barriers: economic, technical, and technological. And some other examples include regulatory uncertainty and the need for implementation of certain legislation, where net zero policies are currently not a priority for our national government. Sindiswe mentioned team composition earlier. This is also crucial, where if you don't have the right team from the outset of your net zero building project, it can be increasingly difficult to implement a net zero building. Next, we'll move on to the drivers. So 5 categories of drivers emerged. Firstly, economic, where we've mentioned load shedding a bit. So a net zero building can be load shedding resistant and allow buildings to continue in operation, thus proving economic drivers. Next, we have technical, where the building will be load shedding and possibly drought resistant as well. Next is policy, where there's pressure from stakeholders and executives in the property as well as compliance with sustainable building standards. Next, we have social, where there's an increasing tenant demand for net zero buildings. And then, of course, you have your environmental benefits, which Sindiswe mentioned, multiple benefits. As I mentioned, it's not just black and white. It's not just drivers and barriers. So we identified another zone, the overlap zone, which we termed the amber zone. So net zero building implementation presents a unique set of both drivers and barriers. But there are cases where there's a blurred line. In this scenario, both technical and economic factors presented themselves as both drivers and barriers, thus falling into our amber zone. In the elements leading up to net zero building implementation, there are many factors to consider, which are all interlinked and have a complex relationship with one another. In our second case study, we noticed that energy efficient buildings and water efficient buildings were prioritized by this organization, as opposed to having GBCSA certified green buildings and net zero buildings. So we found this quite concerning, considering the GBCSA's national targets for 2030 and 2050. It's important to remember, of course, that sustainability is the foundation of net zero as a whole. Our findings were, of course, based on the commercial property market context, which is then exposed to externalities such as the drivers and the barriers.
So in concluding our research, we could say that NZBs are in their infancy in South Africa. Furthermore, we did answer our research question: what are the drivers and the barriers to net zero building implementation? That was unpacked in our empirical model.
So we presented you with multiple examples, but essentially what needs to happen is that the red light and the amber light need to be turned into a green light. At the end of our research, we identified certain recommendations to be made for future research. So firstly, how can the barriers be mitigated and the drivers be enhanced? Secondly, a further detailed analysis needs to be carried out as to why certain organizations don't prioritize having GBCSA certified buildings, such as our second case study. Thirdly, a thorough investigation needs to be conducted into cheaper and more efficient ways of generating power, potentially allowing commercial organizations to be completely off the grid despite their limited roof space when it comes to solar panels. And finally, as mentioned before, there was very little literature on net zero ecology buildings. So if this type of net zero building wants to be implemented and successful, more analysis needs to be carried out and shared with the commercial property market. In closing, we will leave you with a quote from our first and second case studies: if it's good for the environment, it's good for business. Thank you.